Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Pam Bandal. I'm a member of the UK BIM Alliance Exec Team and Engagement Co-Lead, and for today, I am your host for this webinar. A reminder about the UK BIM Framework, which sets out the approach for implementing BIM in the UK for managing information provided by the ISO 19650 series. It includes the published standards, it includes the guidance documents, and it includes links to other resources. As you can see behind the UK BIM framework, there is not only the UK BIM Alliance, but Centre for Digital Built Britain are involved, as are BSI. I was going to say, BSI. And Dan will be talking and presenting from BSI shortly. Before we get into the detail, let me just explain how GoToWebinar works. You are in listen-only mode. And if you have a question, please type your question using the questions tab. Avoid the raise hand option unless you are specifically asked to raise your hand. As mentioned, you are in listen-only mode. It is being recorded and it will be available on the UK BIM Alliance YouTube channel from next week. Just make sure you follow us on Twitter, because that will be the first place we share notice of the recordings. So today, shortly, I'm going to hand over to Dan Rossiter. Dan's going to cover party, tendering and appointments. Earlier on today, we had a presentation around the information protocol guidance. And then later on this afternoon, we've got a part D, developing information requirements. You can see the titles of 3 other webinars that took place yesterday. And as mentioned, they will all be available on the UK BIM Alliance YouTube channel. With that, let me play a video which will help introduce the framework and the guidance to you before I hand over to Dan.
Welcome to this webinar about the guidance supporting the BS-EN ISO 19650 series of standards. The UK BIM framework is supported by BSI, CDBB and the UK BIM Alliance.
I'm Sarah Davidson.
And I'm David Churcher.
And along with Anne Kemp, we're co-editors of the ISO 19650 guidance.
The guidance is supported by a group of dedicated individuals who give their time and expertise for free. These individuals might be authoring or providing feedback on the content.
And you can see that David, Anne and I work alongside them in the management, editing and publication of the guidance. We also work closely with CDBB, who lead on the presentation of the guidance. The ISO 19650 series currently comprises Part 1, 2, 3 and 5. Part 1 covers the overall concepts of information management using BIM. Part 2 is specific to the delivery phase, design and construction of assets, and Part 3 covers the operational phase. Part 5 sets the requirements for the adoption of a security-minded approach to information management as a whole.
ISO 19650 Part 4 is currently under development, and it's due to be released hopefully in early 2022. The guidance was first published in April 2019 in the form of concepts guidance. Part 2 guidance followed in July and has been subject to update and expansion every quarter since then. We welcome and encourage feedback from the whole community, as this is fundamental to shaping the direction of the guidance. So if you have feedback on the guidance, please do email us on guidancefeedback@ukbimframework.org.
The 4th edition of ISO 19650 Part 2 guidance was 160 plus pages long, and this was clearly becoming unwieldy, and some of the key feedback from industry was that we needed to make the guidance more accessible. So in July of this year, we developed a new guidance structure that you can see here. We now have Part 1 guidance setting out the concept of the ISO 19650 series overall. Part 2 guidance considers the specific requirements of ISO 19650 Part 2, and Part 3 guidance, which has only recently been released, is starting to explain the requirements of ISO 19650 Part 3.
In addition, we have guidance parts A to F, which are intended to cut across the whole of the ISO 19650 series, and they cover key themes where detailed guidance is considered necessary. Guidance for Part 5 will be developed by the Centre for the Protection of National Infrastructure, CPNI, in due course.
So Guidance A covers the information management function and resources. It considers the activities that need to be carried out and offers a resource map supporting the information management framework.
Guidance B covers open data and building smart topics. It will also cover COBE, but this section is not yet written.
And Guidance C covers the common data environment in terms of workflow and technology. It looks at assignment of metadata as required by the National Annex to ISO 19650 Part 2 as well.
Guidance D is all about information requirements. It explains the fundamentals of what they're trying to do and the details of different types of requirements with some very detailed examples.
Guidance E currently covers the BIM execution plan in supporting tendering and appointment activities. It will be extended in due course with content to cover more tendering and appointment resources.
And finally, Guidance F covers information delivery planning. This includes the responsibility matrices and the task and master information delivery plans. It also has space for guidance on the federation strategy, but again, this is not written yet.
We hope this provides you with a little insight into the development of the guidance, and we'll hand you over to the more detailed guidance discussion just now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David and Sarah. With that, I'm going to hand over to Dan Rossiter for a briefing around Guidance Part T. So Dan, over to you.
Thank you, Pam, and good afternoon, everyone. Just a quick check, Pam, can you see my screen okay?
I can, yes.
Brilliant. So yes, thank you. I'm here and I'm going to briefly talk to you about the content of Guidance Part E, and please bear with me with this, and it won't be a particularly long presentation, but that gives us plenty of time to focus on Q&A as well as any points any of you would like to raise as part of this. Now, as Sarah and David mentioned, the guidance goes into a number of parts, and Part E deals with tender and appointment documentation. As part of that, there are several documents that are needed as part of tender on both sides of the contractual line. As mentioned in the video, things like the BIM execution plan and others are kind of part of the guidance Part E. But in addition, there's information that needs to be delivered by the appointing party. As outlined in 19650 Parts 2 and 3, it asks for different bits of information to be provided as part of tender from those appointing parties. It includes information like the exchange information requirements, which you'll hear more about later on this afternoon from David and Marcia. It includes things like reference information and shared resources, responses or response requirements, and any evaluation criteria that's going to be used. It covers the topic of today, which is the information standard, which I'll go into detail a little later, the information protocol, which was covered earlier today, and in a future update, the information production methods and procedures. And I'll explain the relationship to some of these documents in a minute. Now, the information standard itself provides standards which information will be produced and subsequently maintained against. And a key part of this is that it is established by the appointing party and at a sufficiently high level during the overall process. As you can see from a quick diagram I've mocked up here, it shows the relationship of some of these documents at various levels. And there are some of them that appear at the project or asset level, things like the information standard, the information production methods and procedures, supportive information, and the information protocol. And then what then happens is at the appointment level, there might be a set of exchange information requirements, reference to these documents, and then a response by subsequent lead appointed parties. So as you can see here, for example, there might be an early design portion where an EIR goes out, some documents are created by a lead appointed party, and then later on, say during the actual detailed design and construction, if it's under a design and build form of contract, there could be a second EIR with those same sort of documents. But crucially, resources like the information standard and the information production methods and procedures are created once and are for the respective project if it's under part 2, or for the respective asset if it's under the guise of part 3. And that's quite important because as different items are placed into it, what we need to ensure is that there is consistency being done throughout those various appointments and as part of the work being done by each of those task teams. For example, as part of the information standard, it may detail things like specific codes for the file naming convention, and having different codes used by different task teams or on different appointments as part of an overall project or in relating to an asset means that there will be real difficulty in trying to amalgamate this work together as a coherent set of documentation or as an asset information model. So as such, it's really important that this is done at the highest level and then it's maintained throughout as part of that process. If you want more details about the relationship between these various resources and how they come together, I suggest having a look at Guidance Part A, Figure 6, which provides much more detail than my slide here quickly provides. Now, several of these documents, several of these resources even come together and work synergetically. And the idea is that each of them cover specific parts that are needed in order to clearly and unambiguously articulate what needs to be delivered. When you consider something like the exchange information requirements, they are expressing what needs to be delivered. They are then talking about what information is needed by whoever is undertaking the appointment, either the appointing party or a lead appointed party, saying what they want to get. The information production methods and procedures talks about the how. It is talking about different methods and different procedures that need to be undertaken on those projects, which might include repeatable activities or information around things like the review and approval process on the common data environment, and then detailing, for example, then how they need to take place and what steps are being done to do that. The information standard covers effectively the content that gets used during those methods and procedures and as part of that scope. So for example, we've already talked about it now, which is things like the file naming convention, looking at the national annex of ISO 19650. It talks about having the standard codes placed within the information standard, as well as things like status codes and the revision convention. So while the information production methods and procedures might put the method out for review and approval, it will refer out to the codes and the standardized bits of content that appear in the information standard. And then ultimately, by creating the what through the how using the information standard, that information is then delivered via information containers that were originally placed on the task information delivery plan and amalgamated into the master information delivery plan. So each part of these resources and the way they come together kind of synergetically creates the sum of what are the requirements, the rules, and the particulars in terms of being able to deliver this information in a manner that is acceptable by whoever has appointed you to do so. And this can be evident in where the information standard is talked about within the ISO 19650 series. And there are several clauses as part of it where it gets covered and it fits into various different areas. For example, when establishing the exchange information requirements, it talks about the acceptance criteria and referencing both the information production methods and procedures, as well as the information standard. So as part of that, then it's able to start to articulate that when you want something and you want it done in a particular way or using a particular thing, that's when these resources come into play to achieve that. As a key document that should be cited in something like the information protocol, it's key to actually collecting the information together when tender information is being compiled. It's used both in establishing and confirming the BIM execution plan, as lead appointed parties are able to review it and then propose alterations and amendments to the information standard. This is because while the appointing party might establish what are the key processes and or bits of information needed for them to achieve their information requirements, a lead appointing party will have their own information requirements they'd want to ask of their respective task teams and may want additional bits added to the information standard so that they can actually be achieved. Establishing the delivery team's risk register. There may be particular items such as how risks are enumerated, as well as considering the risk of what happens if information is delivered but hasn't actually conformed to the information standard itself. So it can support there in two aspects. The fact that when appointment documents are compiled, either by the appointing party when they appoint the lead, or when lead appointed parties appoint their respective appointed parties and task teams, that they will compile these documents together, which includes the information standard. It's used when anyone generates information on a project, thereby being able to reference things like key code to file naming conventions, reference which classification systems are being used and other elements. And finally, it is used as part of the quality assurance check, meaning that for any information to leave the work in progress part of the common data environment process, it will need to actually then have referenced the information standard, and someone will have undertaken the review of that to ensure that when anything appears as shared and is available to other teams, that it should already be conforming to the information standard itself. Now, the process of creating an information standard, there are a number of different bits, and this is where the guidance that's been written starts to delve into some of these key areas of what should be done when forming something like the information standard. The first part is considering what information needs to be captured about the information standard itself. Now, the information standard is a technical document, and as such should have several bits of metadata associated to it, which typically gets captured in things like document headers, document footers, a cover sheet, or captured as metadata itself within something like a common data environment solution. Standards such as BSEN ISO 7200 talk about what are the respective data fields that should be captured within technical documentation, and it comes up with the following mandatory items, as well as several conditional or optional ones that could be used as well, such as who owns the document, what is its unique reference, when was it issued, what's it called, who created it, who approved it, as well as things like how many pages are in there and what page in particular is each page on, to know that items haven't fallen out or that there's a complete document in place. And this sort of requirement should extend in theory to all technical documentation being produced, to ensure that we are able to find out who produced it, when it was last revised, and other key information like that. From a structuring point of view, there is no detail in 19650 as to how it should be structured, while 19650 does give several considerations in terms of content that could be included. And it goes on for things like classification, file naming, and other bits and pieces. A useful area to look at to develop a structure for something like the information standard would be to refer to something like PD ISO TS 12911, which is currently undergoing revision, which actually gives a formal set of structure for clauses originally designed for internal BIM manuals or CAD drafting standards and similar documents such as those. And within them, it includes several example clause numbers that could be used so that there could be consistency between what is being done in-house and what is being proposed for projects. The idea being that if multiple organizations used this structure, it would mean that the same items would fall under the same clauses. For example, you can see the small excerpt I've put on the slide that the actual project stages being used would be covered under clause 2.1. Any revision or versioning would be covered under clause 2.4.4. Things like status under 2.4.5, and then potentially things like classification or breakdown structures around things like 3.2.2. And as part of that, it allows then someone to be able to quickly look in the document, refer to those specific areas, and then check against their own in-house processes to see whether there's a variation, whether there are additional requirements, or whether there are omissions in the document itself. So following this sort of structure becomes quite powerful and provides several benefits in doing so. And ultimately, we're trying to think of what is the content that should go into this sort of document. Now, I'd stress, as with most things, that things like the information standard should be developed fresh for a project. The danger of using legacy information means that one, the information provided within it could be out of date. Two, that the information could not be relevant for the project, which could generate RFIs or start to confuse people as terms of scope or relevance of some of the document, meaning it's less likely to be read and understood. So it's important to ensure that the information in there is specific and relevant for that project itself. And some of the content included could be things like naming conventions, not just the naming conventions for information containers or files, but what will specific objects be named maybe as part of the project if they're being exchanged, what to do about layers, perhaps maybe the naming of specific objects within the information models themselves. So, how you create unique references for doors, windows, rooms and spaces and other items. Whether there are specific codes that need to be used, such as the codes within a naming convention, codes for specification, for status and revision, as well as any other parts of the project, such as naming of individual components. Whether there are specific schemas, data models, model view definitions, or otherwise that should be referenced and used as part of the way that things work. So, for example, referencing to things like COBie 2.4 to IFC 4.0 or other bits and pieces as part of this process. Are there particular classes, properties, units, quantities, values that need to be used as part of the project? For example, if you're working on a historic building where all the information was actually in feet and inches, is the requirement to convert them? Is it going to be that actually the project should work in feet and inches to work with the historic information? In somewhere like the information standard is where you can start to specify what are the permitted units on the project, as well as maybe then if there are requirements around tolerances and other areas as well. So there's an awful lot of content that could appear within the information standard, which supports the ask of what's in the exchange information requirements, as well as any of the methods and procedures that are produced as part of the information production methods procedures. So in summary, and then we'll have a look at what are some of the comments and the questions that have started to come through. The information standard itself is developed at the project or asset level. It's developed obviously at the project level if an organization is following the route described in 19650 Part 2, and developed at the asset level if they're following the route described in ISO 19650 Part 3. It forms a key part of tender and appointment information. It's not just being collected and used as part of the tendering process, but also should be cited as a key document in appointments. I believe in the information protocol, it would refer to it as a information particular as part of that. So it effectively gets cited as a scheduled document within contractual documentation, meaning that it's very important that it's looked at, considered, and more importantly, followed. Within it, it defines the standards to be used when producing, reviewing, and delivering information. As part of that, I've given some examples on the slides here, But I think what's important is to look at the projects that you are involved with, the scope of what's being dealt with as part of those projects, and then working out what are the standardized elements that need to be in there in order to support the project itself. And ultimately, it needs to work in close tandem with the information production methods and procedures. And for reference, there's currently work underway to write the respective guidance to go into party around the information production methods and procedures, and very much they are very closely knit documents that synergize together quite well, and the two quite often should be considered a unit in themselves as opposed to two distinct items due to their close relationship. I think that more or less takes me through it. I don't know how you wanted this to work, Pam, as to whether you just wanted me to read through the items or if you're going to moderate the Q&A. I'm happy to take your steer.
You are more than welcome to read through them, because there is one very long question that I think would make sense for you to read through rather than me say it out loud, but I can do that if you want. You carry on, Dad.
That's fine. So I can see that there are there are two questions in there.
Yeah.
So I'll deal with the shorter one first, which asks about and then obviously there's more coming in, which is good. So keep your questions coming and we can make sure that we can talk through them. So the first question asks about things like coordinates, origin points, and those sorts of items. And this is why I talked about the importance of the relationship between the information standard and the information production methods and procedures, because the information production methods and procedures should talk about perhaps how coordination is done, and then that would actually maybe go through whether you are selecting a 0,0 origin, or you want to put in some form of real world coordinates or similar, and it would go through the procedure of maybe doing that. However, if you had a specific origin or coordinate, I would argue that actually that is a standardized bit of element, and I think that actually that should be put then in the information standard to say that for this project, this is the base origin or base coordinate that's going to be used in the document, and then simply then the procedure is talked about in the IPMP, and then any core details such as the tolerance or the exact origin or value is placed in the information standard. Bear with me for a second while I read through this one. When you discuss a lead appointed party requesting changes, could an example be that this is a cost consultant or QS requesting various NRM codes are used? So certainly. So I think the idea being that as part of a project, if, for example, the appointing party hasn't specified the details of how certain codes should be applied for something like NRM, for example, then certainly that could be the sort of request that's being put back. However, as part of the overall process, what you need to be mindful of is that there may be many projects that are happening in parallel as well as concurrently, and anything that is added in theory then would then need to be coordinated with the other projects. And if there was an alternative coding method being used as opposed to NRM for some of the cost information, and forgive my ignorance, but I can't think of an alternative costing code system except for the RICS NRM codes. But if there were and it was used on the project, then it'd be looking at an amendment as opposed to an addition, which can become quite costly, quite difficult, and cause a lot of rework as part of this, which I think is important to ensure that getting the right things in there at the start is important, and to ensure that there's continuity. And this works off, unfortunately, both sides of the contract line. Because if a appointing party has already used a certain convention for a number of years, then they're going to be keen to ensure that that convention perpetuates on their projects for their assets, because the amount of historic information that they have. So I think we just need to be very careful as part of this to clarify what is an additional bit, which is, oh, I see you have nothing, let's use this, versus trying to change what might be set out in the document itself. So exactly as you've written there, Adam, that if it hasn't been specified as part of this, it could be proposed as a positive way working forward if no alternative has been put in the items being put there. Moving on to the next question. So the question is that it's for project applications where no requirements for any other information standards. What plans are there for organizational implementations that synergize with 19650 with other standard for organizational? So I'll try and unpack this because I'm not sure I understand it the way that it's written. Unless, Pam, are we able to unmute people specifically if they want to clarify, or is that too complex?
No, I can do. This is Bryn. I'm going to unmute you from my point of view, but you are self-muted. If you want to ask the question live, that would be good.
Hi.
Hi, Bryn.
Can you hear me? Hiya. So the question was, because 19650 Part 2 is purely project-based and doesn't deal with organizational implementation of information standards, whether there were any plans for new standards or anything around that to deal with organizational implementation and use of information standards within an organization that were not associated with the project.
Okay.
With an external project.
No, that's fine. Thank you. So stay floating while I think I answer, and then just come back then to confirm if I've captured it or not. So I think I mentioned it earlier, but I might not have been super clear, is that there is the this standard, which is the technical specification, which is PD ISO TS 12911, which is currently being revised. Now, the intent of that document itself was to be the set of requirements and recommendations for a business to develop effectively their own SMPs, standard methods and procedures, in-house as to how they would work as their own organization. So, for example, if a business wanted, to stick out the file naming conventions, their own standard codes, other bits and pieces, the intent was that that standard specifies how you might structure what many people would call, the CAD manual or, the in-house BIM SMPs or similar. What's being currently considered in ISO at the moment is revision to that standard and its relationship to the information standard, the exchange information requirements, and the information production methods and procedures to help show that relationship there. And my hope, although it's still in development, so we'll see, is that it will help bridge that implementation and suggest that actually if you in-house use the same standardized structure as the project uses, it helps you then see that relationship to help understand whether your implementation conforms to the project or whether there's configuration you need to do as part of the mobilization phase, for example, so that you're then conforming to what the project asks for. At the same time, when tendering, you can then account for the amount of changes off norm that's needed to suit the delivery of the project. Does that, at least in part, answer your question, or do I need to look in a different direction?
No, that does it. That does in part. I suppose there is a wider issue, but maybe we should take that conversation offline, unless you want to have it now. I don't know. It might get too involved. That's all.
No, that's fine. So I think the best thing there, Bryn, is that if it answers it in part, what I would say is that look out for the public consultation for 12911, and I think the best thing that you can do, and it's vague advice for everyone, but it's free, so it's fine, which is that if you go to the BSI Standards Development Portal, you can find work items and effectively subscribe or follow to them. And then in which case then you'll get a notification if the status of something changes. So without having to rely on me tweeting it or hearing about it from your professional institutes or similar, you could get the notification that that item is now out for public comment, in which case then I would say that if you don't think then that I've answered that, maybe a good way is to put comments in to ensure that that standard does what you want it to do. And I suggest that anyone else follow that advice as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good. I think we've gone through all the questions, Pam.
I have one question that's coming via email because they're having technical issues, which I've had all day as well. We go to webinar, and it's around tendering. How many documents does somebody need to tender?
Okay. This is probably my fault because I used some lazy language as I presented. But occasionally I said the word document, and I probably shouldn't have. The idea in 19650 is that it's talking effectively about what information is needed, and it talks about concepts like the exchange information requirements, information standard, information production methods and procedures as piles of that information. And in a very natural sense, it would be quite easy to say, well, the exchange information requirements is one document, the information standard is another document, the information production methods and procedures is a document. But in reality, it very much depends on the size, scale, and complexity of your project as to how appropriate that may be. So, for example, if you are doing a very small house extension, in reality, you could probably capture all of that within a single document and actually have maybe the exchange information requirements, the information standard and stuff as separate chapters in that document. If you were just, I think if you worked down to the very extremes on micro projects, if you were to appoint a surveyor to do some surveying work, it might be an email that refers out to the standard internal standards, methods and procedures, and actually you can deal with it at a very conceptual micro level. Whereas I can imagine something like HS2 or other large infrastructure projects may need to cover the concept of the information standard in several different documents. So I think I've sidestepped your question, Pam, by kind of a bit of a cop-out, but I think it very much depends on how big and complicated a project is, because you can make it fit what you need.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dan. Can I just say, I have some homework, because that is the first time I have seen the acronym IPMP, Information Production Method Procedures, is what I think it stands for. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dan.
Yes, and I think it's not officially in the standards that is the abbreviation for it. So I think I only used it because I didn't have the space on my little slide diagram to show it. So it's a bit naughty of me. And I'll add it as a clarity for the presentation, because many people will talk about the information standard as the project information standard, and the information production method and procedures as the project information production methods and procedures. And so you end up with some unfortunate abbreviations for some of these things. And I think the point I was going to make was that we don't refer to it as the project's common data environment. We just refer to it as the CDE. So in following that same convention, it's really just the information standard and the information production methods and procedures. Try and keep things simple. But if other people are wondering why some people say it with project and some people say it without, that's the reason. But don't think of it as something new. It was just, I think, me trying to fit something on a slide.
All right, brilliant. Thank you, Dan. Yeah, so thank you for a fantastic presentation. Really lots of information to take in. Thank you for that. As a reminder, we have this series. We have the final one in a couple of hours with Marcia and with David Churcher, who will be presenting around Part D, developing information requirements. And then for more information, here are the links. Let me take this opportunity to thank everyone for attending, and to thank Dan specifically for your presentation. It has been recorded and it will be available on the YouTube channel next week. With that, I thank you all, and I'm going to end the webinar. Thank you.